Hey everybody, welcome to Geeksvana Live. I hope you're all extremely well. It's the start of another week, the start of another, a continuation of a crazy story, really. Today, we're going to look at the update to really, I suppose, what you can call in whole terms is the DJI ban story in general, as it covers a couple of aspects of the US actions against the Chinese drone maker DJI. Following our last show, the principal opponent to DJI and author of the famous bill now, Elise Stefanik, released a post on social media, which seems to actually take some of the credit for the issues DJI are experiencing in terms of their products being put on hold in customs. It reads, for years, CCP drone manufacturer DJI has been rightfully blacklisted by the US government for actively aiding the CCP. The post then reiterates the human rights allegations that led to DJI being listed as a Chinese military company, meaning that they are controlled, if not owned, by the military and following their agenda. Later in the post, it then continues to allege that DJI are complicit in forced labour in direct regulation of US import legislation. The post then closes looking to bolster the position of the CCP Drone Act, currently sitting in the Senate. So it's a fairly full-on post to be putting out there. Until recently, most of the issues that DJI faced in the US were largely political. There has been a steady increase in the number of federal, state, and even local level agencies prevented from using their products. But generally, there was little impact in terms of consumers purchasing and enjoying DJI products. The recent issues with US Customs does, of course, change that. And before the weekend, DJI took action in the courts against the Department of Defense, naming the Secretary of Defense of the Secretary of Defense Department and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy. Get it right. They are squarely aiming at removing their company from the sanctioned list of companies identified as being part of the Chinese military complex. So that's basically the way they're trying to deal with this. It's that sanction, it's that designation as a Chinese military company that's caused a lot of these problems, and they're looking to basically get themselves off that list. Today, we're going to pick out some of the key points, and as we do, please do remember that this is the narrative from DJI, a party to a legal case, rather than a judgment, and it hasn't been tested or verified in any way, shape, or form. So this is really their first serve, as it were. The introduction, let me bring it up here. The introduction explains who, of course, DJI are. Of course, we know them. Many of us watching know them extremely well. As the major producer of consumer and commercial grade drones, it states that this lawsuit challenges the Department of Defense's decision to designate DJI as a Chinese military company, despite the fact that DJI is neither owned nor controlled by the Chinese military, as the DoD allegedly acknowledges, sells only consumer and commercial, not military drones. So really straight out the park in terms of the introduction. They're straight in there to say, look, this is exactly the level that we're going on. So here they're trying to assert their position of not only not having any ownership from the military and the CCP, but also that their products are not aimed at or particularly useful in war zones. Now, of course, several conflicts across the world have shown how effective even a Mavic can be in the, I suppose, wrong hands in terms of DJI not wanting them to be used that way in a war zone. So it isn't as simple as that, really. The document then goes on to explain that through outside counsel, DJI have tried to engage with the US Department of Defense over a 16-month period. And I found that really interesting. So they have actually been trying to reach out, and they've been trying to do something there. To basically understand the rationale behind their designation. They also explain that a petition was formally submitted under statutory rights to remove DJI from the sanctioned list. So they have petitioned, they have requested, they have asked for more information in terms of actually where, why this is happening and really the background. Now, this was refused, and in September, DJI asserts that the Department of Defense had no option but to provide background after being threatened with judicial review and relief. The Department of Defense is then described as releasing a courtesy copy of an internal report that explains the designation. DJI, within their legal action, then described the information put forward by the Department of Defense as wholly inadequate, alleging that they had confused people with common Chinese names and then drawn connections. So they're saying that's really, how wrong they managed to get this, basically. Which is incredible. DJI feels strongly that the report designated them as a Chinese military company through a deeply flawed process. As a result, they are now identified as a national security risk in the US. So it's obviously something which has fairly significant issues. Now, when all of this first came about, when we first started seeing things like the entity list and that type of thing, it's something where a lot of people didn't think that we would actually have too many issues in terms of the consumer side of things, but this has been trickling down, and that headline issue of entity lists and designations as a national security threat and that type of thing, that's really what started the ball rolling and has actually become a real problem for them. Now, in terms of ownership, the court document actually explains that DJI as a company started out life in the college dorm of founder Frank Wang, who was then funded by his professor. Others, because basically the professor liked his designs and actually gave him the start funding for DJI. Others, including Henry Liu, who's a family friend, and Swift Ji, a high school friend, all played central roles in the original company, and they're actually still the major shareholders of DJI, which in itself is actually fascinating. Now, there's an explanation to explain DJI's position on data security as well within this document. It covers. It is 56 pages, and to say they go through everything in minute detail and cover every single allegation is an absolute understatement, frankly. Including the referencing to the fact that their drones do not need to connect to the internet to operate. Following initial activation, DJI drones can be used in aircraft mode. They also explain that that have the local data mode, etc., which obviously allows them to be able to people to be able to basically fly with connection to the internet, but without any of the data going anywhere beyond the drone, basically. The court document then goes to great length to explain the use of DJI drones in the US by many parties, including first responders, etc. Now, obviously, anyone familiar with the brand will know just how important and central DJI have been to the small drone operations in the US. No matter what you think of the company, their impact on drones in the US and the world has been extreme, frankly. The next section deals with DJI's commitment to non-combat use of their drones, which I also found really interesting, and compliance with sanctions that are already in place. They go as far as confirming that DJI prohibits doing business with any entities intending to use the drones and any of their products, in fact, for combat. There is then some key information surrounding the ownership of the company itself, which is actually where they start talking about things like the actual split percentages, etc., and who the main shareholders are. Now, it confirms that Frank Wang and the early investors that we mentioned before still hold 99% of the company's voting rights, which is approximately 87.4% of total shares, which has actually increased since 2020. The largest group of investors comprises entities in the private sector of around 0.4% of voting rights, which is about 7.2% of actual shares. And then 5 state-owned enterprises have got 0.6 voting and 5.4% actual shares. They state that none of their directors of DJI or their parent company, iFlight Technology Limited, are government officials, are representatives of the government, state-owned entity, or a member or officer of the Chinese Communist Party. So really what they're trying to say there is the vast majority of the company is still owned by the same people, and that actually the outside investment side of things is very small in terms of that. And none of that is currently, because there was some previously directly state controlled. And in fact, even if you add up everybody that is invested in the company that is not the original board members, it's a tiny amount of the voting share. So in terms of whether anybody's controlling the company from that point of view, it's a completely different thing. Now, they don't talk about, obviously, things like the legislation in place in China that does compel both companies and individuals to act on behalf of the state and removes their right to not spy on behalf of the state, essentially. Now, those are two pieces of legislation in force in China. They're fairly recent ones, 2014 and 2017 from memory. And yeah, it is something which nobody really talks about in these issues. Now, just because the company is obviously owned privately and by the original shareholders in terms of the majority of shares, it doesn't mean that there isn't other influences there, which I think is part of what we're probably going to hear in the responses as well. So it is actually, aside from the legal action, of course, it is interesting from an information point of view to hear the current situation in terms of ownership, etc. DJI is a private company, so it isn't necessarily the easiest information to confirm. The document then goes into the statutory framework and background, which forms the basis of the actual technical argument that DJI should not be designated as a Chinese military company. So they really do, as I say, they really do dig deep into really trying to deal with every single part of their designation. This includes explanation of the requirements for designation and why DJI feel that these are not met. And obviously, if they're not met, then they feel that they have a right to be heard and a right to be removed from that list. As well as the designation of Chinese military company, DJI also bring up the issue of being, once again, designated as being a military civil fusion contributor. They also explain that the clearest definition of that an affiliation with Chinese government ministries, etc., is not enough to designate a company. So they've obviously, through their percentages, through the evidence they're giving the court, they're showing who owns the company. And essentially what they're saying is that through the US government's own legislation, being affiliated with these government ministries is not enough to be put on this list, basically. So here they're stated that they've proven that they're not owned by the CCP, etc. And even if the affiliations are there, then, as I say, they're not enough to sanction DJI, according to the company at least. DJI asserts that the US Department of Defense's sudden move in 2022 to announce DJI as a Chinese military company and a threat to US national security has had a significant impact on the Chinese drone maker, both in terms of reputation but also revenue. DJI explained there were cancelled contracts and it was stigmatized as a company and employees, including over 150 employees based in the US. Throughout this document, in every section, DJI make the point that they have attempted to sit down and discuss the details of the designation, but have always been rebuffed or completely ignored, in fact. Sections then reaffirm that DJI is not owned by the People's Liberation Army or the Central Military Commission. It's an astonishing document from that point of view, and we will link to it in the description from the point of view of the ends and the types of conversation, the types of statements that they're making within this. They also state that they have evidence that DJI is not a military civil fusion contributor to the defence industrial base. They refute DoD assertions that DJI has an established relationship with military affiliated research institutions in the PRC, namely the Academy of Defence Technology. DJI go on in the document to refute just about everything possible, similar claims of collaborations with other named military-linked organisations, all sorts of universities and these types of things. And a lot of it really starts to, once you start to get, I would say about 60% through the document, the evidence does seem to feel circumstantial. But obviously, as a whole, that was felt by the US DoD to be enough to designate the company as a national security risk. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of publicly available information, it's the most comprehensive review of DJI's response to a litany of accusations and allegations from the US DoD, even going to the perhaps extreme of showing map measurements of where the company is based, being outside of the recognized region of the apparent military civil fusion industrial park. Essentially, China changed things around many years ago and recognized that the economic benefits of having private company partners working within the military side of things was of course benefiting the US greatly. There was lots of companies, Boeing, etc., and many huge trademark, huge household names that were benefiting hugely from being a private contractor and also working on very serious military contracts. And they wanted to be able, basically, to be able to assist in that as well. DJI deny being one of those types of companies, although it has to be said that stating that you're a few miles outside of the zone, and they actually, I don't know if we can find it here, but they actually show it on a little map. Let me just flip down here. So I know it's towards the end of it, but for that to basically be the thing, the extent that you have to go to be able to disprove it, to say you're not even physically based within the retail park that they're, or the industrial park that they're talking about, it feels absolutely extreme, in my opinion. The document then explains that the domino effect of federal action down to state action and even local action has caused significant reputational and economic harm to DJI as a whole, which you would of course expect it to. The claims for relief, so the action DJI asks the court to take, includes that the statute invoked by the DoD does not authorize the action taken. So they're basically saying there that they don't believe that the information that the DoD have based things on actually come around to that designation. So they also feel that using the latest information would mean that they should not be designated as a threat by the DoD. Therefore, they demand to be removed from the sanctions lists that this action has led to. And of course, the opposite domino effect of that, if that were to happen, is of course you will then see people and these things won't be able to be used politically, etc., to cast aspersions towards the company. Other counts seek to address what DJI see are incorrectly dealt with appeals and requests from the drone maker to find out what information the DoD based their own claims on. So essentially they're trying to say, you've put us on these lists, but you're not telling us why, and that type of thing. The main focus of relief sought by DJI is, of course, removal from the designation as a Chinese military company and prevention of sanctions being applied to DJI through it. The 56-page document certainly puts the ball back in the court of the US Department of Defense. Now, in terms of my thoughts on this, I think that a line in the sand has certainly been crossed where this legal action is really not surprising. Delays to customs are bad enough in terms of hurting DJI. I've heard many reports of people either cancelling orders or holding off purchasing until they hear and that this is cleared up. But if the delays were due to a suspension that utilised existing rules within customs, then there is a veil of official authority, if you see what I mean there. And as explained in my previous video, this would all get dealt with and explained over time, and DJI would get this all back up and running with documentation, etc. But however, if we're then starting to see posts coming up like the one from Elise Stefanik, drawing actual accusations of using forced labour to produce their actual goods. Now, keeping in mind that this is not accusing them of some kind of, wishy-washy, we don't think they're a very good company. This is actually saying that they have been using the slave labor to basically manufacture their goods, which is incredible to make. And I feel like we have crossed the line in terms of putting up the evidence, in terms of where we should see demand and actually, frankly, be given evidence if you're going to make those kinds of public claims. This is more than just a careful and clever use of existing systems to cause delays. And there are outright accusations that if they were made against others within the US or any other country, would of course expect to see swift legal action. And the maker of those allegations being forced to bring their evidence to the public scrutiny. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they respond on it. And depending on how the Secretary of State deals with this and the US government in general, we could well start to see a more serious and public conversation happening in terms of the so-called evidence. Perhaps we'll actually have that conversation once and for all in terms of the evidence that's held by the intelligence community about DJI. The truth of this situation is deeply bogged down by a lot of history, a lot of geopolitics, even regional and national and frankly regional within the US politics as well. Actions against China are popular in the US at the moment, something that should be remembered, that all of that action has also been bipartisan in terms of support so far within that political system. So in my summary, we have a situation here where DJI are using the legal system to assert statutory rights to be heard over their designation as a national security threat. This will, at the very least, force more of a fact-based, evidenced confrontation of the issue rather than the current, frankly, odd social media pokes almost. It's a bit strange to deal with such serious issues over social media, isn't it? The next move will certainly be down to the US government, and we will, of course, bring you all of the details as and when that happens. So I want to pop across now to the chat and see what you guys are thinking about this particular story. We did actually have somebody that joined the chat, which I'm very grateful for, just before the show started. Some drone guy who was saying that his Air 3S made it through LA Customs, but only to be held in Vegas, and it was still supposed to be delivered today, but then he updated the chat to say shipment is now on hold, Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. Now, interestingly, in our previous video, the previous live show that we put out before the weekend on this particular story, there are comments on that video from that same shipping company as well, from people saying, I've got a DHL delivery that's supposed to be coming, and now I'm getting forms through, now I'm getting certain notices and that type of thing. So that's interesting to see what's actually happening there and seeing where this is going. Now, obviously, no one is suggesting that people won't get their drones and that type of thing, but where this ends is going to be very, very interesting. So El Smeghead there saying, who isn't a security risk these days? Well, you know, I think you might be, to be fair. And because DJI are losing sales in the US, yes, this is a big issue for them. And I am hearing more and more conversations, seeing more conversations on the forums, etc. And people even emailing me saying, "Hey, should I not order? Should I delay ordering?" and that type of thing. And it is a real concern, I think, to people who are thinking of ordering some cool new drones. The Neo was obviously fairly severely delayed, and the F3S seems to be getting delayed again now, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see what finally happens. James Thomas, hi, good to see you. Ordered DJI Air 3 last night. Customer service said I would receive my package in 4 days. I live in Colorado. They said that they would refund my money if the package is indefinitely held up by customs. Okay, so that they're actually discussing that at customer service level is very interesting. John Denho, one of our channel members, good to see you, John. I feel sorry for the US flyers not getting the drones they paid for, and I have concerns if the UK decides to copy what the US are doing. Now, I haven't heard anything of that, John, in terms of there have been conversations of reviews of what type of drones are used in terms of policing, in terms of other sides of things. The RAF here in the UK will not give permissions for Chinese drones to fly within their FRZs around their aerodromes and around their bases. So it ekes in there occasionally, but it is not something that I'm aware of is being discussed at UK level, perhaps EU level, but not at UK level. But you know, the old Ripple thing, and it does depend in my mind where this ends, where this actually ends up going, if that makes sense. Walter here is saying, and of course, the US government have absolutely no relationship or influence on private companies. Yeah, and I've said this before, Walter, as well. It's, you know, there of course isn't legislation in place in the UK or the US that states that a company or an individual must work on behalf of the intelligence community of their country like there is in China. And to me, that's a significant difference and a significant concern, but really a political concern of mine, nothing really to do with drones, which is what we're here to talk about. But yes, I agree with you. You look at some of the stories that come out, some of the memoirs out there, etc., in terms of what's happened, particularly in the US, in terms of tech companies and that type of thing, and the government trying to enforce their influence and being able to enforce influence on them is quite extraordinary. So it does sometimes feel like that, doesn't it? Yeah, Clive Clark Watson, doubt the courts will find in favour of DJI or heads would roll. There's quite a serious legal team behind things for DJI. So it is going to be interesting. And they are trying to put this through in terms of the actual statute. So they're actually trying to essentially prove and ask the court to make a very clean judgment. So it is absolutely that I think it's fairly clever that they're not just trying to go in to get a judgment of, are we a national security threat? They're not asking the court to decide that, but they're basically trying to say the evidence put forward for these sanctions didn't reach the benchmark. Does the court agree with that? So I think in keeping it fairly narrow in terms of what they're trying to achieve, I think they've been quite clever, because I agree with you. A court to just turn around and go against the government, I mean, it does happen, but yeah, it's going to be interesting. Yeah, all I can say is I'm so glad I'm not a lawyer. I was completely lost on the first page. And the idea of these little summaries is just that, to be able to give some kind of sort of overview of what they're actually trying to do. No. This is basically at the moment, the sanctions on imports is imports first time of new goods. And indeed, thank you to the people who took the time on my previous video to actually mention they've just flown into the States with a drone in their bag, and and TSA seem to have no issue with it whatsoever. They certainly didn't seem to be on the lookout for asking the brand or anything. So no, I don't think that's an issue as we stand. This is in terms of that system of first-time import, and that's that first-time import where they know a financial benefit is, of course, going back to DJI and back to China. If under the existing issue, if it is this forced labor thing that's happening, that's really what it's designed to do. It's to stop companies using that forced labor and then selling their goods in America. And of course, most Americans, I'm sure, would back that as a principle. But of course, proving that's happened is something much more difficult. Although, of course, if the fact that they can actually, DJI, as they assert, can actually prove that they don't even manufacture even any of their parts in that entire region of China, then it should happen. But yes, to answer that question, as I went off on a bit of a dovetail there, yes, no, it really shouldn't be an issue from that point of view. John Burns, it's all political now, simply because the US have next to no drone manufacturers. Yeah, it's interesting from that point of view, isn't it? And I know it is, the Skydio word, the lobbying side of things does come up. And it's interesting because obviously that has a significant part of the story here. That there is it has a significant story all of its own to tell, and I think in time that more of that will come out. But this is almost becoming bigger than that particular story, and this is almost it's starting to eclipse the whole sort of American versus Chinese drone thing, basically. Cato, any word of customers are conversating? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so no, I don't believe so, Cato. I'm hearing from a lot of people that they've actually gone back successfully without any kind of issue. As I say, it should be that first import issue. That's where the legislation is concerned anyway. The legislation doesn't cover second time, third time imports or people bringing their own goods backwards and forwards. I don't think so yet, Stephen Watley, one of our members. Thank you again for all of our channel members for your wonderful direct support of the channel. Will it be pushing up the price of the used drone market, I wonder? I think if this becomes the norm, it could well be. And obviously, if this is perhaps a little sort of snapshot of what an actual ban in terms of consumer drones could feel like and look like in the US. But I don't think so at the moment. I think it needs to be something in terms of, far greater, basically. So yes, John Burns, an interesting one there in itself, isn't it? It's an interesting one. So yeah, no problem, Cato. $5 super chat. Thank you for covering that question, sir. No problem at all. So yeah, so it's going to be one of those situations, I think, that's going to rumble on. It's getting very serious. Every time we feel like we may have come across the top of the hill where the Senate drops things, or they have to reintroduce the bill as an individual because it comes out of the NDAA, etc. Whenever there's a little sort of glimmer of light that comes through, something else happens. I'm not personally convinced 100% that this will go away in terms of the election, whoever wins, because as I say, most of the anti-China legislation that goes through the two houses is basically has full bipartisan support. In fact, it's very rare there's even 2 or 3 votes against it. So I think there's a really dangerous and there's a really awkward atmosphere politically in terms of fighting back against this issue. Of course, if and you know, I have spoken to many US based drone flyers who will more than happily throw their drones in the bin and make videos of them hitting them with hammers. They won't even want to sell them if there is substantial evidence that DJI are a national security threat. You know, there is, and we often have that sort of feedback from people who are outside of this community looking in, saying, well, surely you don't want to fly drones that could be a national security threat. No one in the community is suggesting that, and this community would react if there ever was any evidence, but there has never been any evidence, and we're now having drones being held at the borders and being held in terms of being imported based on very little evidence, basically. So I think it's going to be very interesting. This could be the point where we start to force out some of that information, or the fact the information doesn't exist. But again, when you enter the world of 2 nations, national security and all that kind of thing, governments are able to make things like even this not necessarily disappear, but certainly become a low priority and get bounced and bounced and bounced. So hopefully that won't happen, and we'll hear some news on it fairly shortly. But whatever we do here, I will certainly let everybody know. And Mick Spanner was gifted a membership by Stephen Watley. Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate that. We don't get many gifted memberships here. So yes, that is the update on this story. I will, of course, let everybody know what's going on as and when we have it. We are across this in multiple different ways, including some of the key press offices over in the States as well that have very kindly included us on their email runs. So as soon as we hear anything else, I will let you know. We will link this particular document in the chat for anybody that wants to download it to have a read. It is interesting because actually there's some really interesting bits and pieces in there in terms of just actually some of the background to DJI and that type of thing, which I think some devout fans would actually find quite interesting as well. So it's a shame it wasn't all so serious. Excellent. Okay, everyone. Sean out. See you next time.